everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Bodacity Show. I'm your hostess, Jeanette Anderson, and I am here with the fabulous Krista Giannak. Did I say it right?
Yeah, Krista Giannak. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm so happy you're here. Welcome. So I'm going to tell you, as usual, a little bit about the official story about Krista and her background, and then we'll find out all the juicy tidbits besides that. And then we're going to leap right into how to share your impact, lessons from a blind skier and writer. So want to hear about that and how to use your story to make more impact. So I'm glad you're here. We've had some challenges getting you on the show. I appreciate you persevering so that we could get you booked. So here's some background about Krista. As the founder of Wise Words That Matter, Krista Giannak is passionate about uncovering clients' untold stories, sharing real impact through the written word. Having once shied away from her own personal journey, Krista now speaks about her experiences facing fear to become a skier who happens to be blind. Clients say that she inspires them to share their own challenges and wisdom with the world. Krista has garnered media coverage for clients in local newspapers and on television stations such as CBS 2 and FIOS 1, I believe. Her journalism background includes feature articles published in local newspapers, magazines, and a hospitality industry trade journal. So that's quite the list of accomplishments, Krista. Congratulations and welcome.
Thank you very much.
So tell us something about you that we wouldn't guess by reading your website or your bio or something that people would just not guess about you.
Oh, I thought I was going to share that at the end.
No, right away.
We want to share the silly little tidbit right off the beginning before they even know me, huh, Jeanette?
Exactly. I want them to find out the juicy bits about you right away.
Well, certainly. I'll tell you this goofy little story. When I was 4 years old, my first appearance on a stage was singing Mary Had a Little Lamb and playing it on the xylophone. The trouble was that if you've ever heard of a hot mic, when somebody didn't realize that people could hear them. Well, as a little kid, I didn't really know about mic etiquette yet. So I kind of spoke off mic, kind of sort of in the middle of the song, not realizing that the whole entire audience could hear me. And I said, I have to go to the bathroom.
I bet they thought that was hilarious, though.
They cracked up. Even at 4, I was so embarrassed.
Well, yeah, but it's also good to know that you can get people to laugh and have humor. But I would,
hey, better learn about a hot mic early, right?
Exactly. So tell us a little bit about tell us what you do and for who, and then tell us why you care so much about doing the work you do.
Well, I'm a ghostwriter and blogger, and I build trust with my writing. The reason I care so much about it is really because I love to learn. And then I love to get to write about what I've learned. So my favorite clients are the people who have something to teach me. They're innovative thought leaders. They're experts in their own fields. And they just exude that passion, which I thrive on.
I love it.
Yeah, they're my favorites because then I get to learn about their aha moments or I get to find out why what they matter actually makes a difference in the world.
So you get to make a difference for you and for them, both.
Exactly. That's the ideal.
Yeah. And so have you always been a writer? Is that something you started when you were really small, or is that a recent passion?
No, I've always had some kind of a story in my head, and I've always had that kind of curiosity spark. I ask questions about everyone, everything. I just want to know how things work, how people work. I have that passion for discovery. Awesome. So when I can work with people who also share that passion, that's really exciting. And when people don't share that passion, that can be a fun challenge to come up with the subtleties of what makes someone different.
Mm. And it can be quite subtle because there's people who are in very competitive spaces like coaches and so forth. So finding that unique voice and what makes them stand out is really valuable, really important. So
Absolutely. It's often with a field like coaching, it's often the story. It's the stories, it's their journey, where they are, how they got to where they are. Not just like sad stories or bearing your soul. It's more like building credibility, boosting that, building trust with the story in terms of the reason I can help you get where you're going is because this is what I experienced. This is what I learned. This is how I grew. And sometimes it's not about you. Sometimes it's about some kind of pattern that you noticed in the community that you're serving. Or sometimes it's kind of a hodgepodge of different types of stories that you can share, but all from that strengths-based perspective, the idea that like I made a mistake and I grew from it, or I learned something new because something happened to me.
right. So speaking of which, how have you, because a lot of the speaking that you do, a lot of the work that you do is centered around talking about being a blind skier and writer and how you've dealt with that, how you've overcome some of the challenges. How has that journey been for you? And what were some of the biggest challenges that you've overcome to do those things, to go skiing, to step into your business, to grow? So what were some of the biggest?
Well, that's a compound question. I guess where
It
would
is.
you like to start?
So what were some of the biggest challenges that you dealt with?
Well, in general, I mean, I've faced a number of fears throughout my lifetime. When I was a kid, I was afraid of walking around the block. And before you start making assumptions, no, not all blind people are afraid of walking around the block.
Mm-hmm.
That was a fear that I needed to face that came from all sorts of places that weren't necessarily all about blindness.
Mm.
And the way that you face, so whether it's a fear that seems like a small thing, like walking around the block or swimming in the pool or in the ocean, or going out there and skiing or getting on video, or I mean, I faced so many different fears.
Mm-hmm.
Going out there to network. I mean, I could go on and on about all the different fears that I've faced.
Right.
And what they all have in common is that regardless of how they may seem to another person, when I'm in the middle of facing a fear, it feels like a big deal. I mean, they may have different levels to me, but it's not about how they're perceived by other people. It's how I'm feeling the fear, the emotion that I'm feeling with it. And also what they have in common too is that on the other side, I felt some kind of reward generally for having faced the fear, whether it's some kind of triumph or some kind of new skill that I was really excited about learning, or in the case of something simple like walking around the block, it's just the knowledge that I've taken a huge step toward growing up and learning to negotiate my world, that I knew, sometimes you face a fear and you absolutely know that if you do not face this fear, you're not going to go any further in your lifetime.
Yep, absolutely.
There are some fears that are just that monumental that on a gut level that you have to face them.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are other fears that are just kind of fun, like the skiing, but that actually turn out to be a big deal once you face them. Because for me, that skiing, even though I'm not a good skier, even though it's a little bit of a gimmick, because there's actually a whole community of skiers who happen to be blind. So when I call myself the blind skier, I feel sort of like a little like, oh man, that's a little gimmicky, right? But by the same token, people enjoy it. It gets people's attention, and it allows me to talk about my blindness from a strengths-based perspective instead of starting from the natural assumptions that people make.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Now, frankly, when I skied, I was terrified and I could see where I was going, what I was doing, which I don't know if it made it scarier or better, because I could see that I was about to crash. but it was a very challenging, very scary experience. When I think of doing it without being able to see where I'm going, that's terrifying. So how
Well, metaphorically, we have to do a lot of things without being able to fully see where we're going.
exactly? In fact,
But we
most
can
things in
see.
life.
What's that?
I said, in fact, most things in life, we have no idea how anything is going to turn out.
That
We
being said, what we can see is we can see the people around us. So in my case, I was able to get through the skiing because I took all those small steps, starting with actually picking up the phone once I was introduced to this community that I didn't even think could ever exist. Like this whole community of ordinary people like me who skied, who are blind. No way. So I picked up the phone and actually talked to the director of this particular program that was running the blind ski weekend at the time, Vermont Adaptive Ski and Sports, in conjunction with a whole national organization, the United States Association of Blind Athletes. So this is a thing. It's not just Krista Giannak, the blind skier.
right.
There was a whole community who'd already done this before, but I was still scared. I needed to get some questions answered about, well, how does this work? And how are the instructors trained? And what about the volunteers? And how much experience? And oh my goodness, do all the beginners get hurt? Do any of the beginners get hurt? When do people start getting hurt? What I ultimately realized, though, after asking all these questions, is that this is what the director said to me. He said, why don't you come and experience it for yourself? The idea that sometimes not only, it's not just the old adage about sometimes we learn by doing. It's, for me, in this type of environment, it's even more than that. The fact that it's difficult sometimes to truly communicate an environment to someone until they actually go and see what it's like. So in my case, I experienced this, I listened to the swoosh of the skiers going by, and I felt that little peppery snow on my face. I heard all those cheery voices around me, the sounds of the snow machine. I felt the fall line under my feet. I learned what it felt like to balance on the skis, what it felt like to make those turns and make those special angles that we call snow plow and other types of wedges and all these different ski terms where you learn what they feel like in the feet, and you learn what it feels like when your skis aren't parallel and what it feels like to fall and all of that. So that's why I'll never forget. It wasn't the peak moment of my skiing was not when I got up on the ski lift. It was actually when the ski guide gave me that little push down that little hill. And for me, that was like the most exciting part. It was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I'm skiing, I'm gliding, I'm flying, and I'm falling. And I'm getting back up again.
Yes. Oh, that's awesome. I love that. And of course, I love the sensory details too of the story. That makes it makes it so much richer and more relatable.
And that's also my world. Without the vision,
yeah,
those are the details that I'm paying attention to that many people will tell me that they didn't even notice.
right.
So they're having all this other input with the visual stimulation. So therefore they're missing some of the more subtle details that I'm describing.
So the pieces that I heard in there in terms of ways to create courage was take small steps. You don't have to leap right in. You can take bite-sized steps. Really find community or support, a structure that helps you to make that leap. And don't try and substitute information for experience, because information will only get you so far, but really the experience is what gives you the information that you actually need about, does this fit for me? Is this what I want? Is this awesome, etc. And really, really a big part of it is also celebrate the wins, however they go, whether you fall down or not, and get up and do it again until you're really clear on, is this for me? Is this something that I want to do? But those sound like some of the components of ways that you tangibly created courage, the courage to step through that fear.
Absolutely. When I do my speech about the 3 lessons that I learned as a blind skier, the first one was indeed to to do my research, to ask all those questions. The second one was to take those little steps that can lead to those giant leaps. And the third one was to embrace my story, because that is something that I personally, I really wanted a fun and positive way to do that, that isn't patronizing, that isn't so focused on disability, and that because I felt like I was sharing the story because other people wanted to hear it and not because I wanted to tell it.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas when the skiing came along, it was the starting point for me to have a story that I was proud of.
Mm-hmm.
For me to have something that I could share that is fun, and that, I mean, frankly, I think any skier should be proud just for trying it.
I agree wholeheartedly.
Just for trying it, just for experiencing it, just for going outside our comfort zones. Exactly. So that brings me together in community with other people who've tried scary things like that, as opposed to separating me as Krista, the blind girl, which mm-hmm. is what a lot of stories about disability typically do.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk about that for a minute, about the fact that initially, so you, like pretty much everyone on the planet, have had adversity in your past. You have challenges, different than some, and very similar to millions of people who deal with blindness. And you were reluctant to talk about your story, to talk about those challenges or your adversity in the past. And then you said that, yes, you were willing to. How did you shift that? Because I know a lot of speakers and a lot of people in their business don't want to talk about their personal story, and especially the tough stuff. They don't want to talk about the adversity or the pain that they've overcome, or where they've been or what they've dealt with. So how did you make that shift?
Well, the skiing, as I pointed out, helped because I was able to do it in a fun and positive way.
Right.
That's enjoyable to tell. Mm-hmm. Also, beyond that is the fact that what I came to realize was, for many different situations, is that people tell stories about us whether we want them to or not. Mm. If I don't tell the blindness story, mm-hmm. here's what I've gotten a few times in my life, that people are just so amazed I show up. Mm. Like, what a story. Krista shows up. Is that what I want my story to be?
Right.
You know, it's those kinds of patterns and those kinds of experiences when you notice the stories people tell about you. Mm-hmm. And you notice they're just not awesome. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or they're not the highlights. And when you notice that the stories are, or maybe sometimes, like, stories can also be, as you pointed out, they can be about weaknesses or they can be about strengths. So in an advocacy situation or a support group situation, I'm going to share stories about struggle. I'm going to share stories about this needs to be changed because this is a problem that needs a solution. And this is a societal problem and blah, blah, blah. Or, you know, this is an individual problem that I need to solve right now. Mm-hmm. Whereas when I'm sharing my public personal brand, I'm going to be a lot more focused on where I've come from and how that's made me stronger. Mm-hmm. So whatever has made me stronger in my life in some way, shape, or form is then possible fodder for my story. Mm-hmm. The more fun it is, the more exciting it is, the more attention grabbing it is, or sometimes the more relatable it is, the more common it is. Those are kind of gauges that I use both for my own stories and for my clients when I help them, when I write their personal stories on their websites or on their blogs or as part of their books. Those are gauges that I'm using to figure out what the benefit to their business might be. And to help them to see the benefit. Because sometimes clients will come to me, especially if they're not coming to me through the story route. Maybe they're coming to me through a web designer or a marketer that I know. Mm-hmm. So they're not already kind of in with that story, like the idea of sharing their brand story. And they're kind of like, I don't want to share. Mm-hmm. And those are the people that I kind of have to just give them examples, and I can also inspire them with my own journey that I used to shy away from my story. I used to see the blindness thing as just kind of getting in the way of what I wanted. The story, especially, even more than the blindness itself, sometimes was the story. The idea that, oh, they're asking me these questions about mundane things that I do every day that aren't exciting to me because they're my everyday life. You know, and I just want to talk about what needs to be talked about instead of how do you type.
Right.
So it was more frustrating than anything else. Whereas when you tell a story about your journey and about the turning points in your journey, so whether it's walking around that block, which is not a fun story, you know, talking about having a panic attack, but then being on the other side and realizing that was really my first key step in my life that I took to face the fears that I needed to become a business owner. So it depends on how you tell the story. Is the story about me walking around the block because I was so scared and I was such a scared, weak little kid? Or is the story about the fact that I took my first step, that was a baby step toward where I needed to get to?
Right.
It's about framing the story.
Exactly. And the purpose of the story, because is a big part of what I hear. Because, you know, as you shared, if you can share the triumphs, the breakthroughs, the lessons, the value that's in it for you and therefore potentially for them as well, that's very different than if you're just telling your story to be heard, to, you know, be seen or known or whatever. I've heard a lot of speakers tell stories, but the stories are purely for and about them, versus telling a story about themselves that is for the audience. And a big part of that is, what is the lesson or the point? What is the learning that you had that could be of benefit to others? And really keeping the audience in mind. So it's not that we have to be perfect, it's that we need to have a point and that adds some value. So how there's so many questions I want to ask you about crafting good stories and how people can do that. And I know one of the things is often we need outside support to do that, because we can't see what's right on the end of our own nose. We can't really see and appreciate our story. And I know for myself, I've been told, I cannot tell you how many times, Krista, to write a book about my life experiences because they're, you know, quite remarkable. And
I get told the same thing.
Yeah. And what I keep thinking a lot of times, and I think what a lot of people think is, well, but it's just my life. Why would it be of anyone else? And what I realize is it is of interest if I put into it, if it becomes an educational autobiography or an educational story, as opposed to just an ego-based story of here's this cool thing I did, isn't this cool and aren't I cool?
Exactly.
You know, it's fine to want to be seen and heard, and it's fine to want to have our ego stroke too. That's okay. But truly, as speakers, as coaches, when we're using story to communicate, it's to have a point and for that point to be of value to the audience. So how do you, we only have a few minutes left, but how do you help people find their unique story? What's because, you know, people talk about a signature story or having a turning point story or whatever. How do you help them find their unique story?
It's all about asking those deeper questions to get to the bottom of who they are, why they matter, and who cares, not in a derogatory sense, but in the sense of who in their community is going to care about what they have to say. And in my case, with learning to share my story, because I'm sharing that journey, the fact that I used to shy away, whereas now I embrace my story, I feel like that makes an impact that has an impact on people and how willing people are to be able to share their stories as well.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And so you do copywriting where you help pull that story out from people and write it for them. And then how do you encourage them to use that? How and where should we be using our stories?
That depends on the type of story and where you can use stories anywhere from your website to your personal bio, your professional bio, your social media, your blog, your book, your ebooks and e-courses. You can use stories pretty much almost anywhere that you have content. And the key question here is, who trusts you and why?
Mm.
The idea that the stories are really a path toward building trust. The stories are really a way to share, because a lot of times people don't care about all the details that we know. And we can make our stories educational. And there are different ways to be educational. I would put it that way.
Right.
Are we doing a how-to, or are we trying to motivate someone to take the first step so that they can then solve the problem with us, have us help them solve the problem? Are we showing them, kind of helping them to shift a particular perspective about a particular item? And I'm very careful. I know you mentioned about your story and your book, that sort of thing, how people tell you, because people tell me to write a book too. And I'm very careful in the sense that I'm not a coach. I've been accused more than once of giving too much advice. So what I take from that, and from a lot of other experiences and a lot of other communications courses and things that I've read, comments that people have told me, is that sometimes it's not about advising people. It's more about sharing our personal experiences so that people can then take them how they will and say, how can we learn from this person's experience and this other person's experience and this other person's, it's kind of the idea, not to say that we can never give advice, but I try to be careful, because I'm certainly not an expert on facing fear, just as an example. And I know that my path worked for me, and that's all I can say. I can't say what'll work for someone else, or what will help a particular person get through their particular fear, because that's not who I am. I can only say that this was my journey. This is how I faced my fears. This is how I learned to tell my story, because I focused on my strengths, because I shifted my perspectives on the story from sadness about being the token blind girl, and wishing that everyone already knew about blindness before they ever met me, to excitement about getting to share information. I mean, even some basic stuff, like I love tech, I love innovation. And I've learned to then share, instead of being bored, oh yeah, I use software that reads the screen out loud, or it outputs it to a braille display. I think back to when I was a kid and when I learned about that, how amazing and wonderful it was to hear the computer speak. I was like, wow, the computer talks to me. This is so cool.
Yeah. So
if you remember when you learned about something that's key in your industry, or that was important for how you developed as a person or as a professional, and you go back to that moment of, even if you can't remember the exact moment, you can kind of get that sense of wonder back.
I really love that. And there's some beautiful deep nuggets in a lot of what you've shared here around not only the practicalities of story and so forth, but who we're being in our world and in our impact, and where we're coming from in our perspective around. Because really,
are we being a strong person who's recovered from something or who's learned from something, or are we being an advocate for change who's going through a shared struggle? Just as two examples, both valid, but both very different ways of telling a story.
Right, exactly. Or are we still telling the story from the victim perspective, and what's in it for us to do that, and what's in it for other people when we do that? So it's really about getting clear on what's the story we're telling ourselves about our story, so that we can then tell better stories. And
I feel there's a place for all stories, including the victim story.
Yes.
There's a place for all stories. But we have to keep in mind, what is our story doing for us and for other people, like you're saying.
Yeah. Well, tell us about, you've got a gift for people. Speaking of storytelling, tell us about what that is.
The 10 tips to build trust with, guess what?
Storytelling.
You got it. Yes, you got it. And that's where I offer, through my wise words that matter, some kind of a behind the scenes look, a lot of what I've shared today, and some other tidbits too, about how I learned to turn my disability story
Mhm.
into a story about ability, strength, and lessons instead of, weakness, or instead of, because, I didn't want people to focus on my blindness. I wanted people to focus on me.
Right.
Whereas there's a way to do that without omitting the blindness from the story.
Right. Yes, absolutely. And where is the best place for people to connect with you and find you?
wisewords.that-matter.com or Wise Words That Matter on Facebook. And I'm always on LinkedIn, Krista Giannak on LinkedIn.
All
And
right.
of course, even better, give me a call, folks, if you want to actually speak and say hello. You'll get a faster response than on any social media channel.
There you go. I love that. Yes, and you actually use the phone as a phone. It's a radical concept.
Yeah, don't text, don't message. I have so many notifications that go off all day long. Most of the time, I have a secret for you all. They're off.
Yes, that's
because otherwise I wouldn't get work done. I wouldn't be able to focus, and I wouldn't be able to do what really matters to people because I would constantly be going through notifications. So I tend to go through them in batches. So if you call me, you beat all of that.
That's awesome. Okay, and they can find your number on your website?
Absolutely.
All right, so that's wisewords.that-matter.com. And what's one final message you'd like to leave everyone with, Krista?
If you think something's impossible, find someone who's already done it. That's exactly what I did with the community of blind skiers.
I love that. If you think something's impossible, find somebody who's already done it. Great advice. Very simple. We know that, and we don't often do what we know. And so make it harder, and we spin and we avoid and procrastinate. So simply reach out and find someone who's done it. In my experience, most people, when you reach out and say, hey, I'd like to connect because I'd like to find out how you did that, most people will actually turn around and say, sure, happy to help. So don't be hesitant about reaching out to strangers and asking them. It doesn't necessarily have to be someone who does it for a living. So great advice. Thank you for that. And thank you for being here. And thank you for the depth of the reminder to really focus on who we're being, what the stories we're telling are, and how to use storytelling to really make more connections, both with ourselves and with other people. I think it's so, so valuable and important. And of course, the other piece is hire someone to help you with that, because we often cannot tell our own stories as well as we can when we get support. So hire someone like Krista who can help you with pulling that story out and really appreciating the depth of who you are and what you bring, because that's the way that you can be the difference that only you can be. Thank you for being here, everybody. Have a wonderful and bodacious week. Thank you for being here, Krista, and sharing your wisdom. I appreciate it. And we will see you all on the next Bodacity show or at the Purpose and Profit Breakthrough event. Have a great week. Bye for now.